Ta-Nehisi Coates has been all over the press promoting his new book, The Message, which Matt is going to review for Left Reckoning, so you guys should definitely check that out. But it's just been really, honestly, excellent and a breath of fresh air to have a writer with this amount of capital with liberals and with people who maybe, liberal Zionists or folks that were unwilling to really even engage in the topic of Israel-Palestine because, it's so complicated. I mean, Coates is just basically saying it's not complicated. It's really not. And he explains what he saw there, and he puts it within a context that makes sense for American liberals. Racial segregation, Jim Crow. And this is what I honestly, and I'm seeing on CNN, they're having these doctors on after that New York Times piece with bullets in their head. The cracks are starting, and there's more coverage of the genocide in Gaza, even though it's not being talked about in those terms, than there was even 2 months ago. And I credit Ta-Nehisi Coates for his bravery on this and for bringing this to the forefront by going all over on a bunch of mainstream shows to promote his book and talking about this very clearly. So he went on with Ezra Klein for the New York Times. And here he kind of calls Ezra out for his framing of people on both sides of this conflict.
Compared to most outlets, I've had a fairly wide range of opinion on Israel on the show. And I've had everyone from right-wing Israeli commentators to actual Hamas apologists. And still I believe that maybe with one exception of people I've had on, that if you got all the people I've had on in a room, they would solve it. And that's because it's not really representative.
Ezra, why is one group right-wing advocates, or what you just said, and the other group Hamas apologists?
What do you mean?
Like, why are they not right-wing apologists?
They're right-wing apologists.
Yeah, that's just not what you just said. Like, you called the Hamas folks, and I'm not saying they're not apologists.
Compared to when I say I've had right-wing Israelis on, I mean people who support Netanyahu, not people who support Ben Gvir and Smotrich. I do not put...
It's not much of a difference
Hamas
there.
Is a complicated organization. I've tried to treat it on the show as a complicated organization.
Right. Oh, yeah.
It did spend many, many years specifically targeting killing civilians. I take that as different.
You said you're different than Netanyahu.
I take that as different than Netanyahu, yeah. Certainly the military wing there. Do you not? Like, what did you think of October 7th?
Jesus.
Oh, I thought it was horrific. It was absolutely horrific. I mean, one of the things I just said in the earlier question was I've spent a long time sort of grappling with the idea of nonviolence. And
I just want to, like, the thing he said there about they've spent a lot of time focusing on civilians. Now, don't get into like the sort of was synchronatic or whatever, the lack of I can't think of the word, where it's both sides on the same, lack of balance here. Go ahead, Brandon, you were going to say something.
No, finish your thought.
I'd lost my train of thought trying to think of that word.
Lack of symbiotic, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
My point I think...
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Brandon.
Gosh,
I will say
traffic here.
Yeah, I'm just too polite.
The audio is delayed for me, so I didn't hear that till after. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I will say I think Ezra Klein stumbling there when confronted with his imprecise, we'll say, framing of the two sides of the debate as legitimate far right advocates versus like Hamas apologists, and then being confronted and stumbling is just an example of how oftentimes when our media and various media, not necessarily the Israeli media, but lots of medias in the West, when they're trying to justify atrocities at home and abroad, they just provide provide a series of like contexts for that violence that paints the person who is the victim as deserving of it without ever coming out and explicitly saying that they deserve the violence against them. And this is a big part of why Ta-Nehisi Coates's appearances has disrupted that, because he goes the next step and, you know, says that despite what you might think about the context under which the violence is happening under October 7th, the history of Palestinian violence against or rocket attacks against Israel, none of those things justify ethnic cleansing. None of those things justify genocide. None of those things justify the concentration camps that Israel is running, like Seder Teiman. None of those things are justified by this context that you're providing. And they don't necessarily want to come out there and stick their neck. Ezra Klein doesn't, you know, a few of these, like, you know, more liberal leaning pundits, they don't want to come out there and stick their neck and say, yes, it does. Like, some people will say, yes, it does. Some people like Donald Trump will say, yes, it does. But when you're trying to justify atrocities to, you know, a more center right, center left audience, you just provide these, oh, well, you know, this cop shot a black person. And let me tell you about the crime statistics in this city. And let me tell you about all these things that happen in the area that might lead to you believing that this is justified. But I'll never come out and say it's justified. And Ta-Nehisi Coates has now started to press people on what they think this context actually means for the ongoing genocide and the previous genocides. And they're stumbling over that because they know it doesn't, you know, at least to them, that coming out and saying that it justifies what we're seeing is just, you know, it's improper. It's not right. And it's not something that they can say or advocate for directly. They've just been taught to dance around it in a certain way.
And you see here how that the language, it's not just, you know, really like when you hear on cable news, the active language about Hamas slaughter and intentional targeting of civilians and, 9 Palestinians died under fire, or tragedy and humanitarian crisis in Gaza. You see that, yes, for many of like these mainstream anchors, these are just like guideposts that corporate media provides for them. Yeah. But for liberal Zionists, like I would imagine it seems like Klein is, it's actually something that they inherently have just absorbed. The idea that Israel is kind of just moral and good by its very nature. And so civilian deaths, I mean, he basically says he doesn't think it's the same thing. Though Netanyahu and Hamas, actually, you're right, it's not the same thing. In terms of the death toll and in terms of the intentional targeting of civilians, Hamas, it was 800 that were civilians that were killed on October 7th, and the rest were combatants. Israel has now, according to a few weeks ago, 99 healthcare workers who were American who returned to the United States. They say at minimum, Israel has killed 118,000 Palestinians in Gaza, and that is likely an undercount. Right. They did in October 7th on one day in Lebanon, and no one cared. No one cared. Yep. And so, like, it really is just so revealing that Klein can't even conceive of the fact that he just made a pretty racist statement. And
backfilling it. That's the word I was looking for. Sorry, Bender, but the word I was looking for was asymmetry. And like the way he says, like the time spent targeting civilians, like never mind the asymmetry of what it means when you're like confined within a certain space and completely dominated. But yeah, like you could say that instead of the raw number of civilians killed, or even the percentage of civilians to combatants killed within it. And Israel is the greater killer of civilians. So what you see is how the term terrorism is used in a colonial structure to justify a certain kind of violence and not others.
I mean, do you recall, I mean, I still see it every now and then, but not too long ago, one of the main talking points you would see from the pro-Israel crowd is that, like, the equivalent of 30,000 Americans died or something. And like trying to also, another thing they would say was compare it to the number of 9/11s. Right. And then, oh God, it's insane because they know that when you look at the raw numbers of people who actually have been killed, there is no one who's been more successful in killing civilians than Israel.
Yes.
It's not even close.
It's exactly right, Binder. And that's also why we haven't had an official updated tally since what? It's like 42,000. It's been stuck on that for 6 months. Like, you know since why January, that is?
At least it feels like.
It's exactly what you're saying. This was the deliberate strategy by Israel. And it's frustrating to me that people aren't getting like hip to this yet. destroyed the entirety of civil infrastructure. They killed all the record keepers and the ability to keep records so they can rely on the mythology of them as the most moral actor ever. And you have liberal Zionists like Klein who inherently believe it. And they're not going to know the true death totals until at the end, when we can get some like people in there to investigate. And by then it will be too late. So at minimum, we have 118,000 dead. At minimum.
I mean, listening to that clip from Ezra Klein's podcast, to me, the most amazing thing was just how Ezra Klein, the silence, like he seemed legitimately taken back at Ta-Nehisi Coates calling him out for his wording. And I don't think that wording is like something he deliberately wrote down to like poke at Ta-Nehisi Coates or anything. I think it's just autopilot at this point for these guys to just automatically oh yeah, I'm talking to someone who's a pro-Palestine Hamas apologist. I'm talking to someone who's pro-Israel, and they're really supportive of Netanyahu. Oh, right-wing figure in Israel. I mean, it's just automatic. And when Ta-Nehisi Coates called him out for that, he was legitimately, from just the silence and his stuttering, shocked that like, oh, what do I do here? What do I do here? Because he still has to, obviously he's not gonna outright admit that he just got called out. He still has to figure something out to say to cover his tracks, and he tries to by jumping to, so what did you think about October 7th then, huh, Ta-Nehisi? Like that was another moment.
Yeah.
After drawing the distinction between the Smotrich and Netanyahu, which like, who is here for that at this point? Like,
yeah, I mean, and you're Binder, you're exactly right that he stuttered and got nervous and moved on to that was him trying to go on the offense to paint Coates as like the extremist terrorist apologist, because he got so uncomfortable by being called out by his reflexive, seriously, racism. And liberal Zionists don't like to think of themselves that way.
Like, let's return to the very fundamental.
The equivalent of what he said for like Americans is if like you came across a Trump supporter and they were going on and on about how they're going to deport all the immigrants, and you said to them, oh, so you like Stephen Miller? And he was like, whoa, not that guy. I just really love Trump. I mean, that's the equivalent. That's the equivalent.
100%. All right. Let's get is there any more of that?
No, I think that's probably as much. Because, I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates has already said what he thinks about October 7th, which is that it's horrible and also not the start of history.
Yes.
Which is all that really needs to be said about it.
All right. Well, Dan from Columbus, I have to keep reminding myself that y'all talking about Ezra now, not Ethan, because I go the same last name. Yes.
Same initials.
Jared, sorry?
Same initials, too.
Oh, yeah.
EK.
True. Bobby Nafo, Israel's making legal justice for the perpetrators of the October 7th massacre impossible. It doesn't want to involve international law in the process at all. Right. Fart Twain, I really want to read the message on my flights back home a week ago. I couldn't find a single copy in Boston Logan or SeaTac. I think I haven't checked the charts, but I'd imagine his book is selling very well.
I mean, the fact that these guys are all inviting him on the podcast, their podcast and shows to say these things. I mean, they don't do that because they want to spread the idea that maybe Palestinians have had it a little rougher than the media has wanted you to think. No, they want to get a piece of that action that his book is selling, and everyone wants to talk about Ta-Nehisi Coates. He's a hot commodity right now. That's why they're talking to him. They want the views. They want the attention. But
yeah,
good. Give it to them if it means you speak to their audience. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's also on that circuit. He has been for a decade now. The real question is, will he get invited back places? Like after he's come on and proved that like these kinds of provocations from the likes of Ezra Klein, from the likes of any number of like liberals or center left pundits are things that he's going to push back on the same way each time. And each of them will not have a response to it if he gets invited back to those shows, because, you know, a lot of people get like excommunicated from that circle for things like this.
Bullprog says, FYI, Hassan has been doing worse than Apologia for groups like Hezbollah and Houthis in his reaction to Zionism. I mean, I don't know what he said, but I really don't care. To be honest, I find the like safe, cozy, rich white people in America picking apart the ideology of resistance groups.
Yep.
there's nothing to me that makes me want to like scream more. It's the height of privilege, and it's just such Western chauvinism. So I support Hassan 100%. I think it's great that he had that Houthi kid on back in the day, and we should be understanding more why Houthis, Hezbollah, all of these folks are resisting.
Yes,
and honestly, I'm like. That's what Klein is like. What he was saying there too, Ezra Klein, like this just like reflexive characterization of Palestinians or Arabs as just savages is disgusting, and it's widespread and shared on the Democratic and Republican side. And liberal Zionists are going to have to confront their own racism. They're unwilling to. You saw that in the Ezra Klein clip. But these are resistance groups. And picking apart what they believe, I mean, it's just, it's
as if it hasn't been massively influenced by the colonial, divide and conquer strategy.
We propped up religious fundamentalist groups in the region for that very reason, so it could make it easier for people. And look, I love bullprog. I mean, I'm not trying to pick on you, but it's just like,
but this is frustrating. And
I disagree with the criticism of Hassan very strongly on this
and the
front.
smearing of people on this front as terrorist sympathetic, as opposed to just fucking mature. I'm sorry, I love bullprog too, but like this sort of thing that's going around, especially when fucking supporters of Israel want to talk about policing other people's ideology. Nah, fuck off.
Yeah.
I also think
mainstream media has been interviewing literal like terrorist groups for decades, because that's what journalism is. You talk to all sides to understand the complete story, and then you report it. It doesn't mean you're supportive of everything or anything they do, but that's what you do. And I mean, the only thing I think of is that Hassan interviewed that young Houthi guy. That's
I don't
all.
think he was technically even Houthi, but like young Yemeni pirate sort of chap. And people want him, I think because of the Asman Gold thing, which I also didn't follow, people thought, well, let's go back and ban Hassan for that. And I would just say, whoever's at Twitch making that decision not to take action against Hassan, great job. That's how it should be worked, is the employees that know better and make these decisions. But yeah, it's horrible.
I also just think, just one last thing, that a lot of times this position that it's apologia is just, for me, an example of how the West is always looking to justify its own atrocities, because what it's oftentimes called apologia are just like the cause and effect of why things happened, like the actual context for why these groups exist and what they're doing, and not a justification for that, but it's automatically taken as a justification for it, because when you provide context for, like, when this kind of context is provided for Western atrocities, like I said earlier, it's usually meant to absolve them of it. It's usually meant to go like, oh, you see, well, yeah, we killed all of the Native Americans here, using smallpox blankets, but it was for X, Y, and Z reason, to establish like a Western democracy, for, to be a shining city on a hill. And I won't say it's good, but I'll just provide that context and let you determine whether or not you think it's good or not. But with a strong hint that it is. And so when you provide context for, why people don't like the West, why people might do 9/11, why people might do an October 7th, what are the actual historical and material conditions that led to these things, people see it also like, oh, you're in favor of it. Because when they do it about the U.S., even if they say sometimes ostensibly that they're not, they are they are trying to justify what the U.S. is. They are trying to justify what Israel is doing. And so, they assume everyone is doing that back to them. It's just projection.
Vinny P, I listened to the whole interview. Ezra was fronting like he was sympathetic to Coates' point of view for most of it, and then he drops that disgusting framing on that question. Yes, that's 100% true.
It was
I'm sure he thinks he's...
Oh, go ahead, Brennan.
I'm sure he thinks he's sympathetic. I'm sure a lot of people think they're sympathetic on the issue, but they've learned how to distance that like sympathy. Again, in a very American tradition, to distance that sympathy from a call for change. Right.
I mean, oddly, Hunger Games was on TV the other day, and I was watching that, and like the almost like the spectacle of like the freaking, again, it's a young adult novel, so sorry if it's a rudimentary reference, but like the crying in the Capitol as the kids die in the freaking like game that the totalitarian government is putting on, like they can feel sympathy for it, or say like, oh, this is so sad as I observe this, but there's nothing that, like, it doesn't motivate their actions or change anything about their perspective beyond that.
It's performative. It's performative sympathy, not in the sense that...
Sympathy, not empathy.
Not in the sense that...
Yeah.
Well, I never know the difference, but I just mean it's performative in the sense that it's something that its value is in and of itself, as opposed to it being fake. I don't know if he actually feels sympathy, but that sympathy is meant to, signal a certain level of liberalness or signal the fact that like he has the capacity to feel bad for like oppressive or the oppressed people, but it's not meant to actually move any material reality.
Right.
A lot of it's honestly just straight up people are brainwashed. Like they were raised a certain way and were taught these things in a certain way. And I think that's also like an under discussed thing about like how young people view this. Like a lot of young people who have been active and vocal about this, it's not so much like obviously social media and getting news from independent outlets and having that access is a huge part of it, but also like the issue was, as compared to previous years and decades, the Israel-Palestine conflicts and everything involving the West Bank and Gaza and the land and Israel's occupation, that before October 7th, it's been obviously there were some events that happened, but it was in the mainstream media and talked about in like school and education wise, it was pretty quiet comparatively to the years before. And I think that's a huge thing that like the young people didn't have this being like shoved down their throats, steal a right-wing favorite phrase, that like, oh, Israel is the run in the right here. Israel is the moral one here. Didn't do anything wrong. And they didn't have that. And they saw what happened on October 7th. They understood what the situation was after that from seeing the media and what Israel's response was. And they quickly realized without having that brainwashed period, having that blank slate that, what happened on October 7th was wrong. What Israel is doing is wrong.
Yeah. Exactly right. JR in Philly says exactly what we were saying. Hezbollah and Hamas are resistance organizations. They provide services in the face of colonial oppression. Hezbollah, I'm sorry. Hezbollah is a major political party in Lebanon. They have civil infrastructure. They have non-combatants. They have combatants. They have politicians. But when you call someone just a blanket terrorist, you don't have to think critically about the fact that it's not just the West that has like, governmental structures. I understand that Lebanon's basically like a failed state at this point, and the government hasn't.
Sure, Israel has nothing to do with that.
Right. That's the point. That's the point. And then, but that's exactly right, because then when it fails because of Western slaughter and influence, then you get people to go around and say like, see, they're savages, they're terrorists, they can't get their shit together. It fulfills the narrative that they want.
Well, also terrorists, like Matt was saying too, and it's become worse, especially under the Obama drone regime, has always just been a construct in asymmetrical warfare to paint the armies, the resistance fighters, whatever the case happens to be, the resistance group happens to be at the time, as something outside of the Western paradigm, and therefore, not subject to the same restraint that, enemy combatants in a European war might be subject to. Like you might be required to, like, I don't know, I just saw Napoleon. So like, hey, you're not supposed to shoot the general because like he's like a nobleman or something. Like
right.
Little gestures of respect in warfare that Europeans imagine that they have been engaging in, and it's just not been true, obviously, in most cases. You're no longer, they're not privy to that. And especially in drone warfare regime that Obama labeled everyone who happened to fit a certain demographic as a terrorist, that was just a manner by which we might sweep civilian casualties under the rug, and like in that war and in future conflicts, because people will reference previous wars America has been in the civilian to combatant rate and the death rate, and talk about Israel's genocide in that context. But a lot of those numbers are skewed based on statistics that were entirely made up by our administration to look less bad, in the face of like, hey, the West as a barbaric regime.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and the word terrorist creates an entirely opposite impression in the people than what, say, a graph showing casualties for years going back would.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.